Hi, my name's June White, and today I'm sharing my primary sources for my research proposal for my senior seminar. To give some background for my sources, my research proposal analyzes the current diplomatic environment surrounding the repression of 1 million Muslims of the Uyghur minority in China since 2014. Now, I'm doing this through a comparison of the Uyghur crisis with that of another persecuted population. I'm bringing forth the argument that intervention in the human rights crisis in Xinjiang remains disproportionate, and that ultimately the international community has prioritized strategic and economic interests over human rights, which has hindered progress on this critical issue. Now, my first primary source is entitled Employment and Labor Rights in Xinjiang, and it is an official Chinese government that details Chinese labor policies in Xinjiang in 6 sections, which includes employment in Xinjiang, proactive employment policies, full respect for workers' job preferences, labor rights protection, better jobs for better lives, and the application of international labor and human rights standards. This document provides important context into the crisis and also kind of frames the situation and how the Chinese government describes these forced labor practices. With such varied interpretations of the crisis and different descriptive words that are being used to describe what's happening, the UN, is declaring it a crime against humanity. The US has had officials describe it as a genocide, whereas these actual policies that Beijing itself is declaring, all of it is giving context into the forced labor and the human rights crisis and what actually is going on in Beijing so that we can better categorize the crisis and the repression. Now, the way the repression is described in the document also kind of frames the situation and how the Chinese government has weaponized state policy and information control to justify repression and neutralize international pushback, which has contributed to this crisis persisting over the last 11 years. This quote from the white paper states, "Through its proactive labor and employment policies, Xinjiang has continuously improved the people's material and cultural lives and guaranteed and developed their human rights in every field." And this specifically shows just how controlled this narrative is, not only in this paper, but just in general Chinese policies. My paper also cites briefly this Uyghur Human Rights Project, who uses the phrase multi-pronged information control strategy to describe China's strategy of controlling information. And now the white paper is a super important example of this because it actively denies allegations of forced labor, and it portrays policies as voluntary and beneficial to the Uyghur minority, despite all of these external reports that say otherwise. Now, my paper also ties to this white paper in how it shows that China is leveraging economic power to control the narrative. It's ensuring that the international stakeholders who might take notice in this issue, now whether that's NGOs, intergovernmental organizations, or just individual countries' governments, they remain hesitant to impose strong consequences due to economic and diplomatic ties. So this all kind of just reinforces my argument that the global response is constrained by political and economic interests rather than this moral obligation that they have to intervene, as they have in other situations, whether that's in Asia or Africa. Now, my second primary source is the most recent country reports on human rights practices for the country of China, as published by the US State Department, and the last time this was published was in 2022. This provides a comprehensive analysis of the human rights situation in China, and it specifically includes Xinjiang and the Uyghur crisis. Now, this report provides detailed documentation of the Chinese government's domestic policies that have led to the persecution of the Uyghur minority, which is super important because if we're going to explore this issue, we have to really understand what actually is taking place, which remains kind of muddled between sources. This document actually underscores the systematic nature of the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, aligns with my argument that these actions are a continuation of long-standing state policies that are just evolving into modernity and are being weaponized against this specific group of people. What's going on here isn't something new. It's something that China has been building towards through like their government policies for decades. So even if, you know, this crisis hasn't been going on and the specific persecution of this people group hasn't, the ideals behind it have. It also, in this paper, gives specific examples and cites specific stories of individuals that illustrates just how severe and systematic the nature of the persecution is. And so through these individual stories, we can kind of see, wow, this really is a crisis that needs to be explored. And it's so confusing why international response hasn't matched the severity of this when we've had so much outrage towards other issues. Now, furthermore, the report's findings highlight that the international community's awareness is high of these violations. I mean, this is a real report by the US government, but yet the persistence of these abuses and the lack of any kind of Chinese change in policy, it suggests a very lack of effectiveness in global response. This aligns with my assertion that the international reaction has been completely insufficient to generate meaningful resistance and is often overshadowed by economic and strategic interests. And I would argue that a big part of what I'm saying comes down to the United States, which obviously presents as a global hegemon and is seen as a counterbalance to China. And so, although my paper is kind of taking a larger perspective of the world not intervening in this crisis, I would say that the United States and subsequently like the West in general not intervening in this crisis or being more vocal or things like that is directly tied. And I think that this document really describes that. Despite this comprehensive documentation by the reputable source of the United States State Department, the global response has been very limited and especially in action, even though rhetoric might be high, specific actions, especially like economic ones, have been very limited. And this reinforces this tension between human rights advocacy and geopolitical and economic interests. Obviously, some of this is kind of beginning to change as we see the new administration come in, and that has kind of presented like a very different perspective on the issue because there's not necessarily care for this specific issue in all of the tariffs and economics that are going on right now. So my paper is kind of retrospective, and it's kind of looking back on the past few administrations and the general US perspective on this issue rather than the very newly occurring things that have happened in the last few months, because we're still kind of ultimately seeing a continuation that this isn't a priority, even if economic interests and strategies are changing from the US, it's not in response to the Uyghur crisis. And ultimately, I do think that these two primary sources, in addition to others, will help to build a strong basis for my argument. But the two that I've highlighted in this video specifically actually contrast these two official narratives from two different countries. So we have the white paper that comes from the Chinese and then this report from the US State Department, and they can show just how wide this disparity is between this state propaganda and the documented reality of what's going on the ground, and how ultimately we're seeing these discrepancies and nothing's being done about it. And so I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I hope that my paper can really bring to light and argue that we are lacking in the way that the West is responding to these crises, especially when we compare them to other ones. Thank you.